Talk to me maybe.
All right, fine. I'll test out to see if our microphone is performing better. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, don't leave it on just the head too long. I think. And don't leave it on the extreme too long. How does the focus look?
That's good. It's sort of in between. You think like this?
Well, I think a little bit closer than that. I would say about like that. There, fine. And then you can focus in closer for a short time, and then a little further away. That's for the most part. That's a little too much.
Wow.
That's too much. And that's a little bit close. Try a little closer. See how that. Good. Very good. All right.
Okay.
All right. I think that's. We'll stop it now. Videotape of Mr. Kurt Stehling in our series of Pioneers of Science and Technology. And now, without imposing on Mr. Stehling's valuable time by a lengthy introduction, I'd like merely to introduce him as a modern Jules Verne whose career has spanned the depths of the ocean to outer space. So please proceed, Mr. Stehling.
Thank you, Clarence. It all began, you might say, as a little boy in Germany, where I was raised in a little town called Gießen, a famous university town, noted also for the birthplace, or at least the working place, of Justus von Liebig, the famous chemist, after whom the university is named in Gießen. It was also the birthplace of General Dernberger, the fellow that headed up the German V2 program in World War II.
Oh, yes.
I noted as a little boy, up to the time we left Gießen for Canada in 1930, I was then about 9 or 10 years old, that there were rocket experiments being done in the vicinity of Gießen by a chap named Willy Geil, G-A-I-L, who was the scion of a wealthy family who owned a tobacco processing factory near Gießen. And he had a rocket car. I also saw rocket gliders in the Wasserkuppe in Germany, a famous glider area. I noted rocket gliders when we left for Canada from Bremerhaven. One flew overhead. So at a very early age, I was imbued with the notion of space flight or rocket flight, and was intrigued with the notion of also deep sea adventures even then. In fact, when I got to Canada, I wrote an essay which was published in the Winnipeg Free Press on adventurers who built a tank-like vehicle and drove the tank down the beach into the water, down under the ocean, like you would drive a tracked tank.
Oh, yes, a sort of miniature submarine.
Yes, but tracked and riding along the bottom instead of being a sub. And believe it or not, that has now come about. There are such vehicles now.
Oh, yes.
At any rate, during my years in Canada, I was influenced by such people as Hugo Gernsback, the founder of science fiction, you might say.
Oh, yes. His magazines were very famous.
Very famous. He had a magazine called Modern Electrics, which he published before World War I. And that magazine had on the cover, and I have this cover, and I think it was 1908, 1910, a space station in orbit.
Oh, yes.
That was well before anybody even thought of satellites. Most people thought of escaping from the Earth by rocket when they thought about it at all, such as the Jules Verne story. At any rate, I was to meet Gernsback later on. I'll come to that in a moment. I met him later on when I was in the Vanguard American Satellite Program. And well, I might as well tell that little incident right now. When I was in Washington, and I'll show how I got there in a minute, I saw Mr. Gernsback's name in the paper someplace, or I forget what. And I called up New York and said, not to talk to Mr. Gernsback. And the office said, yes, just a minute. And so who's calling? And I said, Dr. Stehling in Washington, and so on and so on. And this voice came on, yes. And I said, I'm Kurt Stehling. I introduced myself, being on the Satellite Vanguard program. I was heavily influenced, I said to the gentleman answered, by your father. His famous science fiction and science stories and amazing stories before the war. I read them avidly. And he stopped and says, "What do you mean, my father? That was me."
Well, that's
well, you see,
yes.
And now as a teenager, I thought anybody past 30 was halfway dead, you see. In those days, all teenagers, young people think, when you're past 30 or 35, and I never thought that he'd still be around, and that was him. And he was with a ripe old age. And we met then in New York, and he gave me some back covers for photocopies of his ancient old magazines before World War I, or early amazing stories of the early 20s.
Oh, yes.
And he even predicted radio stars before anyone had discovered radio stars and things of that kind. He was more than just an editor. He wrote and he prognosticated, and I think one of our great personalities. At any rate, to get back to Canada, in my teen years, I was in high school, founded the Rocket Club. And it's called the Rocket and Space Study Club at Central Technical High School in Toronto.
Yes, what year was that?
That was, I got to high school in 1934, spent 5 years at Canada. At those days had 5 years of high school, junior and senior matriculation. 4 years junior and 1 year senior, which is like our first year college here. At any rate, one of the incidents in those years where they called me the mad professor, by the way, in high school, and I was treated with a certain amount of bemusement by the teachers and the pupils, not only as a German Canadian, which had its own problems, Canada not being particularly happy with Germans because of World War I, but and they're not as tolerant as Americans. I was treated, as I said, also with caution because they thought I was, a little off my rocker. And one day, my colleagues and I, my fellow students, those who were interested in rocketry as I was, we built a small little rocket thrust chamber it's called, which burns gases inside and blasts out the rear and it pushes forward. And we had it mounted on a little railing, and we built it in what was then the biology lab at Central Technical High School, chemistry biology lab. And we opened the windows to shoot it out the window over into the big playing field, you see. It had a little head on, like a firecracker rocket, only was more elaborate than that. It had a little gas pressure bottle and so on.
What was the fuel that used?
Methane and oxygen.
Oh, yes.
Yes. And we pressurized the oxygen ourselves. We had an oxygen bottle in the lab that was used we weren't supposed to handle that, but we did. And so I mounted this railing and to point out the window, you see, and they had big French-type casement windows, metal windows. And just as we were setting pushed the little spark button to ignite this mixture, which was by now flowing through the little rocket chamber, we didn't notice it. We were so busy with the rocket, and we could have been killed by the thing blowing up, by the way. The window had blown shut, one side of it, and the thing hit and went right through the window, you see, and made a great blast as it took us. So,
very embarrassing.
Very embarrassing, to say nothing of being expensive, because I had to pay for that window. The other people just disclaimed any responsibility. I was the head of the rocket group. The teachers presumed the worst. A German Canadian, what do you expect? They're all, probably a saboteur or something. Well, I survived that incident all right, but then came the war, and I joined the Canadian Army, much to the distress of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who didn't think they could trust me, but I joined anyways in the Armored Corps. And I was once more acquainted with rocketry in Europe when I arrived in London near the tail end of the V-2 firings.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact heard one fire one night, impact one night. I was staying in London.
Oh, you actually heard
yes,
one
sir.
of the...
Yes, sir, one of the impacts, yes. And I didn't know it then, but it was fired by Dernberger, this German general who was from Gießen, as I was. He was a fellow Gießener in London, being on the receiving end of another fellow shooting these fine things at London, you see.
Oh, yes.
There's a side interest of mine of ballooning, which you refer to since I dive and go up balloons. As a boy, once again in Germany, I helped to launch a balloon one day. It was great fun in fairs, county fairs, you might call them.
Oh, yeah.
In those days, they have a gas balloon. They had all the bottles laying out, and it was hydrogen, of course, and this balloon was being inflated. And I was just a little guy, about 9 years old, and I helped to make myself a nuisance instead of being really helpful. Obviously, I wasn't, but I carried sandbags and so on, but stumbled over stuff. Well, the lady that took off in this balloon wore pink tights, and she hung from her ankle right over our town, floated right above, about 500 feet, hanging downwards, which is not the most, the most elegant way to fly. But then she got tired of that, and she turned around up there acrobatically and hung from her teeth from a long metal silver bar with a knob on the end, and hung from her teeth. So one time in the Vanguard project, when we were all under the gun and I was being interviewed in Chicago on television, I mentioned this incident, and I said that this particular position of hers, hanging from her teeth, reminded me of my job in Vanguard. It kills you to hang on and kills you to let go, you see.
Oh, yeah.
So the V2 incidents, of course, confirmed my feelings that spaceflight was at hand and that rockets had moved out of the laboratory or out of the backyard into big time, you see. I didn't know then about the California Institute of Technology experiments that had gone on, the so-called GELSIT experiments, but the V2, of course, overshadowed the whole business.
Yeah, so of course, and then before that, of course, Goddard had done some of his pioneering work.
Well, I knew about Goddard. Yes, of course. Oh, yes. I'd written Dr. Goddard in 1938, where I said I'd like to do rocket experiments. He answered a letter, which I'm still trying to find it somewhere in my records, where he essentially said, "Don't."
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Don't
experiment. Oh, I forgot. Of course, Goddard had been a hero of anybody interested in rocketry, naturally, and Mr. Gernsback, the science fiction man, had done a great deal to popularize him. But I did not know that actual experiments were going on in California during the war of a more, what should I say, a rigorous nature that Mr. Goddard, with very limited resources, was able to do, you see. Although Goddard worked in Annapolis, as you know, or in Patuxent for a while, developing JATO units, jet-assisted takeoff units for the Navy airplanes, yes. So back in Toronto after the war, I finished my education and got my graduate degrees, but in astronomy, or physics and astronomy. But there wasn't much going on in astronomy in terms of employment, for that matter, or my interest waned because I had just been so freaked out by rockets that I couldn't contain myself. Well, I had a letter from a person at Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, Bell Aircraft Corp, then called Bell Aircraft Corporation, now called Bell Aerospace. And they had written me and said if I wanted to come to the States, they would hire me in the rocket department. However, the question of being a U.S. citizen arose. My wife, by the way, I met during the war on my last leave of working overseas in Buffalo. She's Buffalonian. And I wrote Bell, all excited, of course, that anybody should be interested in me. They'd seen an article of mine, I think, in a magazine. I'd written several things by that time. I was also president of the Canadian Rocket Society and president of the University of Toronto Atomic and Rocket Society because I was also interested in atomic energy.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And we had discussions, lectures, films, and things of that kind. Well, I decided I would come back to the States, a country that had been my goal all along, particularly because of the atmosphere in Canada was not conducive to a German-Canadian doing anything.
Yes, and of course the facilities for advanced.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes. Oh, well, they were far orders of magnitude higher. The Canadians could have done a lot more, but they didn't. At that time, I wrote a man named Dr. Samara in Ottawa, who was in charge of a thermodynamics division of the National Research Council in Ottawa, and I asked if I could join them in their laboratories, and that they had absolutely no openings for junior people, and besides that his budget was collapsing around him, and indeed, shortly after that, he left for Wright Field and worked in the States. Yes. Mm-hmm. So most Canadians who had a technical bent, especially in a line like I'm talking about, had to leave for the States.
What year was that you left for the United States?
49. Yes.
49.
Yeah. And I came to Buffalo and worked for an American Optical Company.
Oh, yes.
As an associate physicist. It was actually late 48 I came over, and they were quite, it was a very interesting place to work, and I got to meet Dr. Silverman, Shirley Silverman from the National Bureau of Standards at that time, or no, he was there later. He was then with Johns Hopkins. And he had a high altitude detector package that had American Optica built for high altitude research with balloons and rockets.
Oh, yeah.
It had a little scanner on it and a small photo optical device and so on.
Of course, at that time, let's see, this was at what city?
In Buffalo.
In Buffalo,
yes.
So
of course, I was in the right place for rockets because Bell Aircraft was just down the street, you might say. And I contacted them. They said, well, since you will get your citizen papers in 2 years, having married an American, I was a war bride, you might say. And I got my papers in 2 years, which the immigration people told me would be the case unless I did something that they would throw me out of the country or refuse my papers. Well, I kept myself very clean, and in fact, in 1950, middle of 1950, I got my papers. It was 49. I came late 48, excuse me, fall of 48. So it was 1950 when I got my papers, to the day of 2 years. The Bell people were anxious to have me come aboard because of my various technical papers I've written, about 4 of them, 2 of them for the Engineering Institute of Canada Journal, on thermodynamics and heat transfer. So they still could not take me, though, even with my papers pending. They said within 6 months of the papers they could take me on an unclassified basis. I could work in a non-classified portion of Bell Aircraft for that length of time. Then they'd have to can me, because if I didn't get my papers then, they just couldn't do anymore, because there had to come a time when I had to get into classified work. Most of the rocket work was classified, you see. Now, except certain theoretical studies, which I did. Interestingly enough, the Bell people had hired a good many Germans, including Dr. Dernberger, General Dernberger, the German that headed up the V2 program, which I didn't know. And when I was at Bell, and by the way, they were not citizens, yet they, some of them had been Nazis, yet they were hired, and they could handle classified material. And here I was an Allied soldier who had been wounded in Holland, and I couldn't, couldn't do it. That's
yeah.
little,
well, there are always
the little ironies of life. Yes. I met Kraft Erika there, the gentleman who passed on last year, a famous space pioneer, and Dornberger. And one day I met Dornberger in the hall. I was introduced to him, and he spoke German to me without even asking me if I could speak it. He was an arrogant fellow. And he spoke immediately auf Deutsch, and then he said, "Where are you from in Germany?" Mind you, he didn't know me. He may have known about me, but he didn't know that I could speak German. And he went on in German, and I said, "Gießen." He said, "You're also Gießner." He presumed that I knew all about him, which I didn't, you see. I knew something of him. I didn't know he was a Gießner. And it turned out not only was he from the same town, but he knew my mother.
Remarkable.
My mother's people were French Huguenots who had settled in Gießen a long time before and owned a furniture place, a big furniture emporium, you might say. And Dernberger, as a boy, had been there, and I'm not sure if he even worked there for a while or something. Anyhow, he knew my mother. My experiences at Bell were absolutely sensational. Bell was a repository of advanced technology in aeronautics and in rocketry. The first VTOL, first vertical takeoff plane in this country that amounted to anything, was built at Bell with 2 jet engines. It's now at the Air and Space Museum in the Garber facility here. There was a German rocket Messerschmitt airplane, Messerschmitt 163, sitting on the floor. There was a German jet sitting on the floor. They had part of a V2. I mean, I was in 7th heaven. And of course, I got a fairly responsible position very quickly as head of the rocket physics group, where I studied flame propagation and flame developments within a rocket engine. The bursts of fire you get inside, the heat transfer problems, the fluid pressure problems, the injector design. I got into attitude control too for rockets, but not as much. I was mostly concerned with engine work. I got to work on the X-1 rocket airplane.
Oh yes, but you really got in and very pioneering work.
Yes, I was at the very beginning of all of that, and the X-1, when I was there, in fact, flew through the sonic barrier with Chuck Yeager at the controls. And I helped to, if I may say so, I hope modestly, helped to solve some of the vibration problems of that engine. Before it was ever flown supersonically, the rocket engine would vibrate and would chug and so on. We helped to smooth that over. So I played some small role in that. I worked in a number of pioneering areas using, for example, ozone and fluorine as propellants, as oxidizers, which give a lot more energy to a rocket engine, but they're very dangerous to handle, so they've never really been adopted in any big way. I also worked on new methods of igniting rocket chambers. I developed a new injector head, it's called, a head. It's a plate with holes in it that sprays all the stuff into the rocket chamber, like a carburetor, you see. And then it mixes with the...
gives more even burning. And
yes,
all
sir. Yes, sir. Right.
You
right.
Get more power.
You get more power and so on. But that was a tricky thing to do. They never were designed quite right. And so I worked on that and found some new techniques for improving that. And I got a couple of patents. I also got a joint patent with a man named Wendell Moore on stabilizing a rocket aircraft at high altitude so the wings don't tip up. See, a rocket airplane at 12, 15 miles up, say 80,000 feet, is no longer a true airplane because there's not enough air to sustain it. At 90,000 feet, the atmosphere is practically gone. There's enough left to support a balloon, say, but an airplane has to work very hard to fly. And it's very difficult to stabilize it because it'll tend to tumble or do something else. So you need little jets at the end to act as reaction devices to keep the thing stable, you see. And I helped to develop that system and got a patent on it.
Oh, yeah.
That patent. And that was used later in the Mercury program, which Bell Aircraft got, that same system.
Yes, I was just going to say that in space vehicles for control use little jets.
Yes, sir. That was adopted for the X-15 and the Mercury control capsule and the later ones. Bell gave me $1.
Well, fine. Well, then you were
reimbursed. I was on my way, yes, and
right.
and they got a $14 million contract out of this from the Mercury capsule. But I had the fun of doing it, which was all that counted. I also became involved in the American Rocket Society, which was then the American Society for Rocket and Spaceflight. Well, I was a member as early as 1946, one of the earliest members, or early members. Besides being still president of the Canadian Rocket Society, which I relinquished when I came to the United States. And the Canadian thing drifted off and it became moribund, but it picked up again later in the form of a new organization. But I started it. And in Bell, and then I became a director of the American Rocket Society later on. During the most crucial years when the Atlas missile was being developed, the society was under the gun to help formulate national policy. And I sat in many meetings, which Bell supported me for, in my later years at Bell, 55, to help sell the notion of spaceflight. Now, Bell sent me out on a lot of talks. You might imagine spaceflight was a curiosity those years, 50s, I'm talking about 1950, between 50 and 55. And it was a curiosity, and people were, just like they talk about flying saucers these days, it was treated as sort of an offshoot. And my own rocket engineer colleagues were rather bearish on the whole thing. They thought with all the rocket engines blowing up left and right that I was a wild dreamer here to think of an orbit, to say nothing of going to the moon. Speaking of going to the moon, in 1948 in Toronto, I had given a talk before two joint societies, the mechanical engineers and my own little rocket society, which was reported in the Global Mail. And I stated there that within 20 to 30 years, we ought to be able to land on the moon, land men on the moon, based on the fact that the V2 had grown in 5 or 6 years into a monster rocket from a little one. I've extrapolated and said if we expanded at the same rate, the V2 program, not the V2, but rockets like it, we should have a rocket big enough to land us on the moon. Well, Professor Chant, who was then Professor Emeritus of the David Dunlap Observatory, where I'd worked, north of Toronto, wrote a letter to the Global Mail, in which he said that graduate students will make such statements as to landing on the moon, which he said was an impossibility. There isn't enough energy on Earth to do that. ought to be suspect. And we wondered whether I should qualify for graduate work, because the kindliest interpretation he could put on it, noting my war record, I was shell-shocked. Now, that was an unkind thing to say, you see.
That's amazing, but there are an awful lot of incidents like that in science.
Yes, sir.
For instance, naturally long-distance radio communication is impossible, and it was proved mathematically by physicists and so on, that absolutely impossible from the energy standpoint.
Yes, sir.
And so you're in good company.
Well, I had my setbacks because of that. I had difficulties with my thesis because they looked at me. So I wrote on radial star transformation, radial star velocity spectral shift, very straightforward, good stuff. Nothing with rockets in it. But at Bell Aircraft, oddly enough, there were only two people who really spoke space, you might say. That is Kraft Ericke, the man I mentioned, is German expatriate. The paperclip guy came after the war with Dernberg and the rest of them, who was then at Bell for about a year or two. He was already talking orbits to Mars, never mind going to the moon or orbit. He had his whole office full of charts and diagrams. And when I was introduced to him, and Kraft became a dear friend of mine later on, I felt encouraged because while the rocket gang, as we called ourselves, the rocket house, who actually built things, there was a lot of pessimism about spaceflight, and I was treated as an impractical person. I got encouragement from Ericke. After all, he worked very close to Mr. Bell. He was one of the top dogs in the organization, and in what I call mahogany row. If he was allowed to speak spaceflight, why can't I? See, except that he didn't have to report to people who were hardened mechanical engineers, not rocket engineers. That was just the name you adopt, and who thought what the rocket engines took off every second day off towards Niagara Mohawk Power Company, a mile down the road, and they blew off. Never thought we'd ever get anywhere, you see. Although the X-1 rocket experience, the X-1 airplane should have convinced people that it was just a matter of extrapolating, you see. So Ericke became a good friend, but I also met General Kepner at Bell Aircraft. General Kepner was one of the people who flew the Explorer 1 balloon in 1934 up to 65,000 feet out of the Stratobowl near Rapid City.
Oh, yeah.
And the 50th anniversary of that's coming on this fall, November 11th.
Yes.
They flew on November 11th. No, he didn't fly November 11th. The second flight did. He was on the first flight, which flew about the same time. And Kepner was a remarkable man, a retired general. He had a plush office. He was assistant to Larry Bell, as most generals would be, of course. I don't know what he did there, but he certainly had a great time, and he was noted for the fact that he had several big white poodles, the biggest ones I've ever seen in his office.
I'll be there. And
he had a steward to look after them. I think you may remember your colleague at AEC had that, the lady that, she had something like that, didn't she?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And, the woman that became governor of Oregon, yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, anyways, Mr. Kepner spoke up for me because I got some flack over in the rocket. My boss, once removed, Bill Smith, a very fine man, of the best, a good, hard-nosed sound engineer, got impatient with my going around talking spaceflight, even though the Public Affairs Department of Bell Aircraft were sent me and paid for my travel. Not the rocket people. Still, he said, Kurt, you're just going too far. He said, I think we should transfer you over to somewhere else in Bell. He said, you're not recognizing reality. These rocket engines are just, we're not going to, it'll be, you and I won't live to see this.
Yes, again, this is about 53.
53, 54, yes.
54, oh, yes.
Yeah, but things were beginning to stir in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And here's where I come into the selling of spaceflight. Besides talking to groups, some influential, and I gave a talk at the New York Planetarium, Hayden Planetarium, which was recorded also, as you're recording things. There wasn't any videotape then. And I worked with a colleague named Fred Singer, who was well known in this area.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know you want to talk with him sometime. He was with the Air Force, the Office of Scientific Research. But what happened was I was appointed to a committee of the American Rocket Society called the Spaceflight Committee, I believe, yes, yes. And the purpose of that committee, consisting of fairly senior members of the rocket fraternity in the United States, senior meaning that they'd either made a name for themselves with patents or with doing actual experiments or had published learned papers, the normal route to achieving a certain amount of notoriety. These people were gathered in Washington under the direction of a man named Andrew Haley, a well-known Washington lawyer and a founder of Aerojet, the famous rocket company.
Yeah.
And Andy was a remarkable man. He was a communications lawyer, very wealthy, not so much from the law practice, which is remunerative enough already, but from his shares of Aerojet stock, which he had. Being on the ground floor, the lawyers usually do very well, you see. So he hosted the committee meetings in Washington, and we met also in New York. We met Alan Waterman, who was then head of the National Science Foundation, I believe, was the first one, wasn't he?
That's right, he was the first.
Yes. And he
Correct.
promised, and General Putt was involved, and several people on the Hill, several congressmen, whom we approached with a committee report, which was published in the Journal of the American Rocket Society, was also sent to members of Congress and other influential people, the press. And the idea was that the United States should have a small satellite, begin an orbital program of some sort, using whatever rockets came at hand. I had designed a rocket system of my own, based on an American Viking rocket, which was built here at the Naval Research Laboratory and by the Martin Company. At any rate, we tried various stratagems to interest the public, and sure enough, we got some coverage. Time magazine published it, as they also published another idea of mine. Time did. And this was funny. They published a one-page digest of an article I'd written for a magazine called Aviation Age, in which I proposed that we use a high-altitude balloon to launch rockets, based on the experiments done by Dr. Van Allen, Jim Van Allen, whom you know, University of Iowa.
The Van Allen belts.
Yes, yeah, right. And he had suggested, partly on a letter I'd written him in 1951, he had suggested the notion, he and a colleague, of firing rockets from high altitude, because you do two things that way. First, you gain about 15 miles altitude to begin with, so you have that much less gravity to fight. And you also fire in a low pressure atmosphere up there, so a rocket is more efficient in vacuum because the gases coming out are not interfered with by the atmosphere. The less interference there is, the more impulse you get, you see. So I proposed that. It was called Project Saloon, Satellite Balloon Launch, Saloon. Maybe that didn't help. I got a lot of levity out of that. But Time magazine did pick it up and published an entire bit of diagram. I still have this, of course. And there's an interesting story connected with that. This was in 1955. I was guest lecturer each summer at a place called Plattsburgh State University, now part of the New York State system. And Dr. Tuttle, the dean, had invited me to give a week's talk to science teachers of various schools, and even nuns from parochial schools came. And I was the local hero, you might say, of spaceflight. I was always talking about it. And this was my second year. This is 55. I'll never forget this. This was on the end of July. And I was busy gassing away to these assorted science teachers, telling them about exploring the universe, launching rockets and so on, how one would get into orbit, and establish a base on the moon someday. And the back door opened of the lecture room, and a gentleman said, "Excuse me, Dr. Stehling, could you, may I interrupt?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "The president must believe what you're saying, or something, because Time magazine has just released an article on your idea for a balloon launch rocket. It just appeared, full page." And he said, "Furthermore, there's just been a news flash that the IGY committee, International Geophysical Year Committee, have recommended, and the president has accepted as of today, the notion the U.S. should build a satellite." The two things came out the same day. The Life article did, and the news flashes came out that the president had suggested Mr. Eisenhower had recommended a satellite program based on the IGY proposition. Everybody associated that with my article in Time, which no connection, of course, you see. I knew that there had been deliberations in Washington that there was something coming along, but I didn't expect it that soon.
Yeah.
The reason the president did it in end of July 1955 was there was a meeting in Copenhagen called the International Astronautical Federation, which is an international consortium of spaceflight people who come from various countries, including Russia. And we wanted to surprise the world and tell them that the U.S. was prepared to go into space in a peaceful manner. And I have another incident like that coming up in a minute, which I'll tell you, also related to the IAF and an announcement. At any rate, the few telephone lines to the village of Plattsburgh up there in the Northland, forgotten by most people don't even know where that is, were red hot that night. Every wire service was calling up, NBC, CBS. They flew reporters over to Burlington, Vermont, because they couldn't land in Plattsburgh, and they came across on the ferry. For 3 days, we were inundated, thinking that old Stehling, they found me out from Bell Aircraft, of course, because they mentioned Bell, and I had a colleague named Ray Misser, a graduate student whom I was helping at Loyola College there, who had done some of the work with me on this. Anyhow, we were absolutely besieged. Well, I tried to get the record straight, but they didn't believe it. They said there was something going on. You know how the press is.
Oh, yeah.
But it shook Plattsburgh to the roots, really. Nothing like that had happened to them since the War of Independence, you see.
I can very well remember how that captured the imagination of people.
Yes, sir.
Because I was in Europe as a delegate to the first Atoms for Peace conference.
Oh, that early,
yes. Which was the first one, and coincided, incidentally, with the President's announcement and the International Geological Year announcement.
Yes.
And instead of the headlines heading up, the Atoms for Peace.
Yeah, this was
space. So
well,
some people were irked about that.
To make a short story long, or a long story the other way, I was invited to join the Vanguard project, the American satellite project, which was announced by Mr. Eisenhower. And that autumn, Martin Company wanted me, made me a very fine offer, but also my good friend Milton Rosen, who lives in Washington, who was head of the Viking program, which is an high-altitude rocket research program at a Naval Research Laboratory. He called me and said, "Kurt, we'd like you to head up the Vehicles and Propulsion Division for Vanguard." He said, "You've been talking spaceflight all these years," because I protested. I said, "Well, thanks, Milt, but I've got a good job at Bell, and we got a nice home up there. The children are just beginning to go to kindergarten and so on." He said, "Well, you know, Kurt, you're an intellectual fraud if you talk that way. I mean, either you're going to get into space or you're not, you see. Here's your chance." So of course, I was seduced, if you pardon the expression, into that. And we left in the winter of '55 in the heavy snow through Buffalo snow are unnoted throughout the world, down to Washington, where I assumed my role at the Naval Research Lab. And Vanguard, and I won't say much about Vanguard. That's generally well known, except it was supposed to be the first American satellite. It turned out to be the second, because Von Braun and his group in Huntsville had a rocket that was ready to go long before Vanguard was ever finished. And Vanguard was, when the Russians had announced Sputnik, of course the U.S., the push was on, get something in orbit right away to answer that Russian problem of dominance in space. And I'm coming to another funny story, or interesting part, about announcements coming at a critical time. In 1957, we were not yet ready to launch a Vanguard by any means. Dr. Hagen, the overall boss of Vanguard project, Milton Rosen was technical director, Hagen was overall director. Hagen suggested that, and Milt did too, that I go to Barcelona, Spain, where there was then a conference coming on spaceflight called the International Astronautical Federation, like the one I mentioned in Copenhagen a couple of years before. And so I didn't have to be persuaded very hard, although we had many rocket problems. I had a staff of several dozen people who were supposedly capable of carrying on. And we had nothing planned in the way of a launch. So I went to Barcelona. When I got to London, on a MATS flight, the military air service flight, in the morning of London, checked in my hotel at the St. Germain, and I got into the lobby, went upstairs and got ready, washed up, and went down to the lobby, and there was a newspaper laying there that said, "Satellite signals detected in Britain." And I thought they were referring to the satellite nations, as they were called then, the Eastern Bloc nations, who were sending out clandestine radios. Well, it took about 30 seconds for me to realize that this was a Russian satellite. which had also been predicted, but in an offhanded manner. Von Braun and I had gotten to know each other very well. Dornberger, I didn't have much to do with at Bell, and I never saw him much after I left Bell. He was a peevish man, and always felt he was upstaged by von Braun, and correctly so. Von Braun was the engineer, you see. That talk of having the shock of your life, that if that cliche can be used, it would apply here. Well, it didn't take long for a phone call to get to the St. Irvins. I had a plane that afternoon to Barcelona, and the call was from Dr. Hagen, who apparently got up at 3 in the morning, or 4 or 5 in the morning, to call me, and said, "Kurt, I'm glad I caught you. You know what happened?" I said, "Yes." In a strangled sort of voice, he said, "I want you to shut up in Barcelona, not talk about Vanguard, cancel your paper. Go to Barcelona, avoid the press, go someplace, take a holiday." Well, I got to Barcelona, of course, I couldn't avoid the press. They knew I was on the program. But the Russians were the heroes.
Oh, surely, because
they were the heroes.
That accomplishment just captured the
attention. We could have easily done it, but we didn't.
But I think I mentioned to you that the Russians in June of that year had published a paper which said they were going to put one in orbit.
That's right.
And the frequencies on which they were going to send the signals were such and such,
20
megacycles and so on, and so that there was no big...
it shouldn't have been a surprise.
It shouldn't have been a surprise,
yes.
But it certainly was.
Yes, it was. And now I must say, in retrospect, that and it wasn't a tremendous surprise for me. I knew something was going to happen, but still it was a big enough one too, as it was to the Vanguard group. What I should say is, in retrospect, is this: it's a good thing they did launch first, because had we put a satellite in orbit that summer using the Redstone rocket, we would have sat back smugly and said, "Well, here we are again. We're the dominant nation of the world. We are ahead of everybody else, the Soviet Union. Nobody can beat us." We would have gone nicely along. The Russians would have launched, yes, then we would have said, "Well, they're imitators." By doing it first, we were awakened from our lethargy, which we were drifting into, that we were the best technologically. In a sense, we were, but not in all areas, you see. And you remember what the educators, they used that as a great, to increase science and so on, support for science and education in general, you see.
Yes, that was the first big education push to catch up.
It erupted like a geyser, you see, the whole nation.
And that's very interesting that you point out that if we had done it first, probably...
No, it would have been this...
had nearly the effect.
No, sir, and would have been
never really thought of it in that way.
No, I've had discussions on this. I gave a lecture at MIT where I said the same thing. There was some protest by a couple of professors, but then on further discussion, they did realize that a society like ours needs something now and then to shake it up. A democracy, which is rather amorphous, and there is no often any clear-cut statesman-like approach to things. We have all these various pressure groups all trying to run a country, you see, and the spaceflight part wasn't getting that much push in the administration, except for that small endeavor that Mr. Eisenhower announced, Vanguard being, after all, a relatively small rocket with a tiny grapefruit satellite. Well, you may remember that we did finally launch after a couple of explosions, which came about because the rocket was not ready to go. We were not an operational rocket. We fired test vehicles. Well, as you well know, test airplanes, for example, often crash because they're not yet operational. That's why you fly them with test pilots who expect the worst, you see. And that's why you have to go through a certain number of accidents. That's how you learn. We did get in orbit on St. Patrick's Day in 1958. And in my book on Vanguard, I call that the miracle of St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, yeah.
It did get up, even though the rocket was still only test vehicle number 3, and it had 2 more test vehicles to go, TVs, before we got to an operational rocket. So Mr. Eisenhower, grumpy as he was about the whole matter, calmed down, I believe, and we were in business. Although we had several more failures, we did launch several satellites, which produced, as you know, some very fine results, including noting that the Earth is oblate rather than a pure sphere, and the oblateness was measured by Dr. Siri, a member of our staff. Milton Rosen, my boss, to whom I was deputy, he joined NASA, and I also became part of the administrative staff of NASA as Vanguard was phased out of the Navy and became part of NASA, as did von Braun and his group, and this was 1959.
Oh, yeah.
Now, my career after that, certainly at NASA, consisted of working on the lunar project, the program planning and evaluation staff. We did write up an Apollo type of project in 1959, 1960, but we didn't think we'd do it before 1985, considering the pace of development that was going on.
Now, that was a reasonably fast development.
Yes, sir, for that 30 years, yes. But no, I mean not 30 years, but 25 years. Well, what we didn't realize was going to happen, again, maybe the CIA knew, but they weren't telling, was that the Russians would launch a man, Gagarin, you see. This was happened, when, 1960 or 61. By the way, we had actually put a man in space before the Russians did. We had flown the X-15 to 350,000-foot altitude, 70 miles, which is space flight.
Oh, yes.
You remember the two Redstones?
The first Sputnik was what?
It was less than that's right. Yes, like it's true. It's true that the rocket came back right away, but it certainly penetrated space, outer space as we call it, by the standards of the Earth. That is, it's not far out, but I mean, 70 miles was a good altitude, and no atmosphere at all. It's pure space. And the X-15 had done that, and yet it got very little play in the newspapers. Was not much was made of it. We had put a man into a ballistic orbit, which we later did with the two fellows that flew the Redstones. You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
The Redstone rockets, Shepard and and Grissom, Shepard and Grissom. They flew the Redstone rockets not any higher than the X-15 had done it, a little bit higher.
Yeah.
So we didn't capitalize on that. Well, the Russians flew Gagarin, and once again, in a way, it was a good thing that they got all the world's publicity and all the world's adulation, because the U.S., feeling ashamed and inferior and negative. Now Mr. Kennedy, who had now come to power, decided we'd go with the one better and really pull out all stops. And as you know, in 1961, I think it was, he announced the Apollo project, of which I was a member of the team. A team was set up called the Gulliver Committee, or the Large Launch Vehicle Committee. It had several names, Kavanaugh Committee and so on, under the auspices of Mr. Kennedy, who had decided that once and for all we were going to do it right. And you know what came out of that Apollo project. There is another little amusing thing connected with that. In the spring of '61, I was asked to give a series of lectures in Europe, in Israel and in Europe, on rocketry and spaceflight. This was foreign invitations, and NASA decided to send me. My boss then was Dr. Dryden, you know, the first administrator of NASA, acting administrator. Webb was the confirmed administrator on. Dr. Dryden called me in his office a day and a half before I was supposed to leave to Europe with my family. They were going with me. And he said, "Kurt, have you seen this?" Later magazine from Life magazine. There, Life had come out with a picture of me as part of an article. And the article said how we can beat the Russians. Everybody was trying to beat the Russians into some super spaceflight project. And I had suggested gigantic solid rockets instead of liquids, even though I was a liquid man myself, liquid rocket expert, you might say. But I knew about solids too, of course. We had a solid rocket in Vanguard, third stage. So I knew about it. I said, we want to push it fast and not develop these very complicated liquid rocket engines. Let's pour giant solids, which, by the way, are used on a shuttle now for takeoff, and do it that way. And Life had quoted me. I'd given a talk in Washington. The Life reporter was there. And they did the story. They had called on me about it, but I didn't think they were going to print anything. I mean, they tried to do a story on me earlier in my balloon work, and also things I did at Princeton University, where I was on a short leave from Bell Aircraft. But I'd forgotten about a matter in here. And he says, and Dr. Dryden said, "Now, explain this, Kurt." I said, "Well, let me look at it." I hadn't known Life had come out that morning, and he saw this. He said, "You know, you got me in all kinds of trouble." Mr. Kennedy called me in and said that, what do we have here? You, Dr. Dryden, tells me it's going to take a long development to get our rockets going and to build these giant boosters. And here, one of your scientists on your staff is telling the world through Life magazine that we can do it quickly with solid rockets. Who's the boss and who's right around here? I said, yeah, and I said, Dr. Dryden, first of all, you cleared my talk.
Oh, yes.
Well, he hadn't really. He just passed it on. He knew I was sounding off all the time. And I said, I gave it without any fear or favor to a public podium here, and was mentioned briefly in the Post or Star or something, and I didn't know Life. He said, didn't you know they were going to publish this? I said, well, Life had called me that the report had covered this, Al Rosenfeld, but I didn't think anything of it, and I was going to talk to our public relations people about it sometime. I thought this might be a month. You know, Life has a long lead time, sort of story. And he said, I note that you're about off to Europe on a NASA lecture tour. He said, you're not going to Europe unless I get a rebuttal from you or an explanation of exactly what you mean by these innuendos in the magazine, innuendos I could call them, or hints that we can do this. I want that explained. And there was a fellow at NASA who was the rocket solid rod expert. I knew about them, and I knew all about them, but there was a man in charge of the whole department. Fortunately, he had been quoted also because they called this guy up.
Oh, yeah.
Life did, and asked him, is Stehling right about this? Oh, yeah, oh, sure, solid rockets.
Yeah,
that was his business after all. He said, he said, I don't agree with him on everything, but he said, we can build solids. So fortunately, the blame was spread around. He was a very senior person also at NASA, so he had to sit down with me, work all night to write a paper, because I was anxious to go. I had my reservations ready, everything set up in Europe for us. And I came 24 hours with no sleep, staggered in Dr. Dryden's office and laid this on his desk. It turns out that he never used it. He had called the president back, or somebody did, and said, well, we've got this explained, and the solid rockets have certain problems, etc. He wrote a position paper. Well, yes, he did use a little bit of this, but you know how it is in the government. You write tons of stuff, and maybe 2 pages get read, you see.
Surely.
You've gone through that,
Dr.
Yeah, Clarence.
It continues.
Goes
in
on.
fact, it's worse now.
It's worse with computers now running thousands of miles of paper out of their machines every year, and Xerox machines doing all this. We just churn out the paper, which very rarely gets read, you see. Well, I went on to my lecture tour to Europe, and everything went well, and in 1963, I was offered a position. NASA was getting to be highly compartmentalized and highly institutionalized, which tended to leave those of us who tended to be the fiery fanatics about things somewhat in the cold, you see. And I was, I helped, of course, with some of the Apollo design work and so on, and the notion of orbital transfer in orbit and all this sort of thing around the moon. I worked on all that, yes. So I joined Electro-Optical Systems Corporation in California as vice president. Electro-Optical was in the forefront of lasers and various electro-optical devices, spectroscopy for solar simulators. And it was an interesting experience. California didn't suit us too well. However, my son Andy got the smog didn't agree with him. And we didn't live out there. I just shuttled back and forth, and we shuttled back and forth. It was a very hectic life. I got a call from a man named Ed Wenck, who was one of Mr. Humphrey's assistants. In 1966, I had to join the staff of Vice President Humphrey on the Marine Council, because now I'd gotten interested, not so much in the rocket engines anymore, which were all now regular business. There wasn't much you could do anymore. Although I wrote a couple of things up that apparently made contributions on cooling these engines, these big engines. But I'd gotten interested in remote sensing things from orbit, which now is big business, as you know, weather satellite, Landsat. Yeah. I published the first paper anyone ever published on classified paper, or for that matter, I believe the first, in 1952 in Bell Aircraft, on seeing things from satellites. And I gave it in Europe, in Zurich, and it got quite a reception. The American Rocket Society, however, the Journal of the American Rocket Society in the United States, refused to publish it as being too far out.
And of course, that is one of the big features of uses of satellites in space today.
Yes, sir.
And it made tremendous contributions.
It did. I published the first paper showing the kind of video systems you could use. I calculated the radar resolution you needed. I even had radar in there. And I'll give you that paper sometime soon and show it to you as an example for your files. Well, I published other articles in the meantime in a couple of learned papers on the abilities of an orbital vehicle to recognize certain features, assuming certain optics. Well, of course, as you know, the Air Force had been working on this all along. Not when I started it. When I published my paper, which was later classified, by the way, and then declassified, the Air Force had just begun to think about the notion if they ever have a satellite, which most of them didn't believe, they could use it as a recon vehicle.
They were depending on the U-2s.
Yes, sir. Right. Yeah, right. And high-flying balloons and things like that.
And photography.
Yes, yes. So the executive office, Mr. Wenck, had noted my efforts in this area, the design of vehicles that could see things like that from orbit. And he said, we need a person like you in Washington on the council, in a very senior position. Well, very senior, it was GS-18s, whatever they're doing. That didn't mean much in the executive office. Almost everybody seemed to have that. And he said, we'd like you to come here and become a staff assistant, if you were. Because Wenck had talked to a colleague of mine on the Capitol Hill who had heard me say one day that I was getting fed up with the smog in Pasadena, that my family wanted to get off from this rat race and like to stabilize in Washington and so on. And Wenck, noting that, said he offered me a job. So I left EOS. I had a sort of a contract with them to stay at least 3 years, which I did. And then I left and settled back in Washington, you might say, instead of shuttling back and forth every week on the jet, you see. I must have taken 100 flights out there. And the family, quite a few too, you see. And we had a rented place. Oh, it was terrible. But I got a lot of experience in electro-optics and lasers, which I enjoyed very much, and even wrote a book on lasers, which got reasonably good acclaim. A contrast to other books, or my daughter's book, which was 3 million copies. My daughter Wendy, I told you about this book, It's in Thighs 30 Days. My efforts were picayune, but who's interested in lasers or balloons or rockets and computers? I wrote books on these subjects, as you know. But the laser book did do fairly well by the standards of ordinary books, because it was just at that time in an upswing. Everybody was interested in them. Well, on Mr. Humphrey's office, I stayed there from 1966 to 1970, 71. Mr. Agnew came right after Mr. Humphrey, so I stayed on. They phased out the office. I was able to write up the original paperwork, the white paper that led to CSAT, a famous satellite that was the first one to cover the oceans. My feeling being that the oceans, covering 70% of the Earth's surface, need something like that. You can't fly airplanes over the oceans and do much. It costs you too much. What airplane will cover 70 million square miles of water surface? Yet you need ocean current information, ice, air-sea interactions. I'm going into the whole lecture, what you can see here. Radio altimetry, undersea features, if you know what I mean, cold spots, hot spots, upwellings, fish distribution. You can see all that from satellite with the right gear.
Of course, that's a remarkably valuable asset.
It's one of the greatest we have, yes, sir, right. And the meteorological satellites came out of that, out of the notion of remote sensing. I had also proposed that, although the real hard work was done by Vern Somey at the University of Minnesota. And my work on the CSAT, which Mr. Webb reluctantly bought, Mr. Humphrey, in our staff meetings, when all the big agency heads came and we staff members sat in, Webb was not too keen on that. First, he was busy trying to get the Apollo project going, but he also, I don't think, had much faith in anything that could be done in the oceans. Land, maybe. The Geological Survey had a leg up on us because they could point to land problems, crops, forests, and so on, erosion. Whereas the oceans are still being treated rather cavalierly in this country, even today. We're surrounded by oceans. They are block against invasion. They create our weather. They supply food. They are a transportation place where we ship things. And our fleet works on and so on, yet they're treated as sort of a sidelight, you see. And my own agency.
Well, in most people's mind, it isn't as glamorous, or it isn't useful tomorrow. Popular mind.
Well, Dr. Larson, I should tell you that you know very well from your own senior work in the government that the lobbies make out. And how many lobbies are there for the ocean? But you get the cattle lobby, you get the grain lobby, you get the corn lobby, you get the land erosion people, you get the land management, you get all of that. The Department of Agriculture. Is there a Department of the Oceans? A little one, no, but that's a picayune outfit compared to the agriculture. I know that Mr. Humphrey was trying to sell the notion of fish protein concentrate, catching low-grade fish and then turning the fish into a powder which could be fed to developing nations where there's kwashiorkor, which is a which is a protein deficiency disease.
Yes.
He forgot, by the way, that first of all, many of these nations, such as the Muslims, for example, and Hindus, can't eat any. Well, the Hindus can't eat any animal protein.
Yes. Well, can they eat fish?
No, many of them can't.
Fish.
Well, some can. I don't know the distinctions between them, but I do remember all the flack that came on that the left-wing press, as usual, assailed us by saying we're trying to poison these nations by selling out. But we also got a big feedback from, if you pardon the pun, from the agricultural people. One fellow in the Midwest made a big noise about why does Humphrey propose fish protein concentrate from a factory built by the government, which he wanted to do, a government built. When he says, I'm making fish meal out here, feeding it to cattle, I should be building that. Big flap on the hill about it, the whole thing petered out to nothing, you see. He made us eat these fish protein concentrate cookies, which tasted terrible, by the way.
I can imagine they would.
Yeah, they were very dry. Yeah, we had them just to show that we loved them, which we did. He was a fine man. Well, I proceeded with my remote sensing activities and managed to, as I said, sell the notion to NASA via the vice president of a CSAT, it's called. It finally was built and only lasted a few weeks, a couple of months actually, but in that short time before it pooped out, it produced an immense amount of wonderful ocean data, including altimetry, which showed for the first time that there were bends and curves in the ocean produced by undersea mounts, gravity anomalies, and so on. It's never been done before.
Oh, yes. Well, we certainly have enhanced our knowledge of the oceans tremendously.
Yes, sir. Well, I'd gotten with all that business about CSAT and the oceans, I now began to get interested in the marine affairs, since I think I told you I had done a paper as a young boy, an article on climbing into the sea with a tractor, with a tank. I was fascinated by the sea as I was by space. And I proposed, I left the council and I became an advisor to Dr. Bob White, who was then head of NOAA, National Oceanographic Agency. And on a part-time basis, I also did work for AID in the State Department and EPA. I suggested that we do undersea research. They did found an undersea research office, which I did not head, since I was only there 2 days a week at NOAA. I was committed to the State Department, but I did act as a senior advisor. I got Ed Link, the famous aviation pioneer, who had founded a foundation in Florida called the Harbor Branch Foundation, with money supplied by Johnson & Johnson people, the medical people. Seward Johnson Sr. was then the president of this foundation, which is devoted to marine affairs, marine research. And Mr. Link built a submarine called the Sea Link, a tiny research sub. And I suggested to him, I met him on the Marine Council because he was a consultant to Dr. Wenck. Almost everybody was a consultant. He was one of the consultants to Dr. Wenck in the Marine Council in the Vice President's office. Well, I got to know Mr. Link and stayed in touch with him, and I suggested that I use his submersible, which had a peculiar feature. At the bottom, there was a hatch. And if you pressurize the inside of the sub, the back part, the two parts, the front part was isolated from the rear. The front was a plexiglass bubble. The rear was an aluminum chamber. If you pressurize the inside of that to the ambient pressure, the outside pressure, then you could open the hatch, no water would come in, since the pressure inside was the same as outside, and you could do what is called lockout. You could dive out of it. Or you could dump packages out of it. You could dump cassettes. I suggested we use that sub to do something that fascinated me for years, was studying physics under the sea, particularly neutrinos, which is getting right in your game. And as you know better than I, the ocean acts as a filter, doesn't it, for all of these random particles that you don't want, and leaving the neutrinos and their concomitants, the muons, right, the mu mesons, to be detected. Actually, the mu mesons, as you well know. And I suggested that in conjunction, and I approached a man named Fred Reines, whom I know you know well, the discoverer of the neutrino. He backed the notion, as did Louis Alvarez and others. And in typical government style, I formed a committee right away to see if they would back my contention that we should do undersea physics. In the meantime, Ed Link said I could use this submersible if I could find a package of cosmic ray detecting equipment which could be thrown out of the sub at some depth and left on the ocean bottom to be retrieved later, you see. Well, I could go on and on with this, but we did finally work out a scheme with the University of Washington, an experiment out there, where we put emulsion packages on the bottom of the ocean. And we prepared the emulsions, the photographic emulsions, right inside the sub. I stayed at the front. I couldn't go to the rear, but I stayed at the front. I helped to control the experiment, and this guy in the back poured the emulsions on glass plates. Imagine doing all that in a compartment 40 inches high, at 2,000-foot depth. Sat there for 12 hours, cramped, tired, just terrible. But he packaged them all, poured them, and dried them, all within the sub with an electric dryer with a diver next to him. We always had to have a master diver with us in case something happened. Not that you can do much 2,000 feet. If something happens, master diver, no, you're finished. So
psychologically important.
Yes. Oh, well, at shallow depths, he could do things. Or if we were stuck down there, he knew all the controls and everything else. I sat in the front with the pilot of the sub. He was the pilot. And I was observer and co-experimenter. Well, we put them in glass spheres made by Bentos Corporation. And these spheres then were thrown out of the... You say, how can you pressurize the sub to 2,000 feet depth? If you do that inside, we'll all be saturated with gas and we'll die in there. I mean, 2,000 feet depth is tremendous depth. And if you put enough atmosphere in the back to prevent water from coming in, you'd just be, it would take you weeks to decompress, even if you weren't killed by that pressure surge inside. So what the Harbor Branch people did was to build what they call a cosmic chamber, an aluminum chamber that sat in the ocean bottom. And we rendezvoused, like space rendezvous. We came down and sat on top of this chamber, and then by a complicated process managed to pressurize the inside of this hollow chamber, which looked like a large tumbler made of aluminum with 4-inch thick walls. And we managed to get the inside of that chamber to the same pressure as was the back of the sub, atmospheric. Then you could open the hatch into the chamber without the ocean rushing in. It sat tight on top of this thing. We dropped our sphere, glass sphere full of emulsions, into that, and then closed our hatch, repressurized, let the water repressurize that bottom cosmic ray chamber so it was back at ocean pressure. We were still at atmospheric pressure, the hatch closed. We released ourselves. We were stuck one time for 4 hours before we get loose, and came back to the surface, which took an hour in itself or two. And we left the spheres down there for 6 months, came and retrieved them. Now we had to pick them up again in the same fashion, bring them into the chamber, reach down on 2,000 feet depth, mind you, and bring them into the back of the sub, and then open them up and develop them all within the sub, because you couldn't take them to the top, because then the random particles, which you know so well about, would saturate the plates, and you wouldn't see anything of the mu mesons, which you were trying to measure.
Fascinating experiment.
Yes, sir. Well, we finally...
It strikes me as being a very dangerous thing to...
it had its dangers, yes.
To try to go from 2,000,
to atmospheric depth, yes. It had to be any... yes, sir.
And the slightest leak
would have been...
or a gasket fail or something.
Yes, sir.
Like
We had an O-ring crack on us, but it sprayed water into the chamber and up into the sub like a jet of steel, but we got the hatch closed in time. Yes. Now, later on, we went to a new experiment where we didn't use emulsions which have only a small capture area, as you know. You can only pick up so many mu mesons trails, which were analyzed by the University of Washington. We got some new data which was published. We used detectors, photoelectric detectors, photomultipliers, which looked into the water to pick up a trail, which you know well, of course, called Cherenkov Trail, left by the mu-charged mesons. The neutrinos, as you all know, leave no trail, right? Yeah. Being uncharged, but the mu mesons, which are the concomitants, you might say, leave a luminous trail, and we detected those, and once again got some very interesting data with these photomultipliers feeding the data into a mini computer, which I helped to design, in the back of the sub, a tiny computer which did all the analysis and storage of data and sifting out what was good, what wasn't, you see. Now, unfortunately, NOAA got wind of this. I had hidden it under certain other names, like bioluminescence. They said they couldn't support physics any longer. And they were right, and they said it wasn't NOAA's job, although we shouldn't be that compartmentalized in this country, but we are. And the Science Foundation gave me some support, but they were soon besieged by the top dogs in the physics game who said, enough of this little submersible business, let's go big. Let's have a giant undersea detector, which was later called DUMAND, D-U-M-A-N-D, Deep Undersea Muon and Neutrino Detector, DUMAND. That project was a direct derivative of my little efforts, and it's one of the biggest physics projects that will come along in the 20th century if it ever gets funded. to detect neutrinos from the galactic center or elsewhere with a colossal array of folded multiplier tubes put at 15,000 feet off Hawaii.
Oh, yeah.
1 kilometer cubed, Dr. Larson, 1 kilometer cubed of thousands of folded multipliers. Where did it start? With Uncle Kurt piddling around with his little mini sub.
I'll be there. That's a fascinating story as to the development of...
Yes, so that came out of that, and I've been credited a little bit with this, but of course when you get the Nobel laureates and this, and you get the Rhinuses, these people are the masters of this game.
Oh, yeah.
They soon conveniently forget where it started, and then you can't blame them. They're busy with their own projects. But it did start that way, and that's been chronicled, you see.
As that old saying, sic transit Gloria Mundi.
Sic transit Gloria Mundi is one of the little aphorisms one must constantly keep in mind. Well, I should conclude with the fact that I mentioned earlier ballooning interest I had.
Yes, well,
and
you must...
yes, and I have made many flights. Once I appeared again, life seemed to have a fascination with me for a while. 3 or 4 times they even showed me on the cover with a balloon basket. But again, sic transit Gloria Mundi, who remembers that? Who remembers Life magazine? Most of the young people don't hardly know that exists, you see.
Yeah.
They see it as some aberration on the newsstands once a month. But in 1974, I was asked by the Smithsonian Institution, who had known about my balloon flights, including several attempts to cross the country, which ended up almost invariably in rough landings, breaking a bone here, breaking a bone there, and so on.
Yes, in fact, I remember the first time I met you, you had your arm in a sling.
Yes, sir, right. That was, balloon landings often called crashes. I just call them normal landings, you see. And you have a high wind, you have no control. You just bounce all over the countryside, as I've done in Texas. You can find my tracks in the soil in many parts of this country. Well, when I was approached by Mel Sisfine of the Smithsonian and Mike Collins, who was the lunar astronaut, head of the Smithsonian, to be advisory curator for them, visiting curator, to help design the light of an air hall for them, balloon and airships. They had their own designers, their own people, but I was a visiting person who came 1 or 2 days a week to help them with the layout. And the thing is, in fact, represents mostly my ideas for placing things. I should have really been a spaceflight man, but I'd gotten out of spaceflight now with the balloons, you see. And I was also asked later on, as the design progressed, the Continental Oil Company had wanted to do a movie, which they would fund, about something having to do with the history of flight. And it should inevitably begin with a balloon flight. And since I was the balloon person there, they said, would I do the flight? They didn't have to twist my arm very hard. But I did several things that made it possible. They didn't have the money or didn't want to pay the money for the helium, which would cost for that particular balloon, N2749 Alpha, about a balloon I'd flown many times, 35,000 cubic feet, 40 feet diameter. It would cost about $3,000 to $4,000 to fill it with helium. But I knew Admiral Geiger at the Office of Naval Research, the head of it. And he, the dear man, authorized the release of helium for this flight, provided the Navy got a little publicity out of it. Navy having a lot of helium at the time, not knowing what to do with some of it. And so I got the free helium for the flight. We first tried in Vermont, where bad weather scrubbed us. Then we finally made the flight, which appeared in the movie To Fly, as it's called now, in Canaan Valley, or Canaan as I call it, Canaan Valley, West Virginia.
Oh, yeah.
And so the poor old Navy had to fill us with gas up there in Vermont, and the balloon had to be I scrubbed the flight with my co-pilots because the weather was just closing in on us, and it was going to last a long time. But when we got to West Virginia 3 months later and started over again, Navy once again brought the helium trucks in and did a great job of supporting us. Why, this time we filled, this time we went. The high-pressure system came in, and we did a thing unprecedented in balloon history. We took off, I say we, because in that film you see only me in a top hat, but there are 3 fellows underneath in a basket under a tarpaulin with a walkie-talkie. It doesn't pay to be an 1830s balloonist with a walkie-talkie talking to a helicopter. How do you rationalize that, you see? And they were yelling up at me, get the damn thing going, let's go. We were dying in the heat because it was a warm day, and under a tarpaulin, 3 bodies in a wicker basket at 1,000 feet up is not exactly a refrigerator. You see, they were melting underneath there. So I told the helicopter to hurry up and take all their pictures. Well, they're not going to be hurried. They were paying thousands of bucks for this thing. So about 2 hours later, they took all the pictures they wanted, which you see today, of course, with me waving my hat and so on. And these guys came up half dead stupefied from heat. And the reason they were in there was, of course, they with me, controlled this balloon, although I don't have it down here. It's up in Pittsburgh or Akron, well, either place. But they also helped launch it and help fly it.
Oh, yes. That's a fascinating experience.
Yes, sir. And we landed, well, let me tell you the real weird thing that happened. We landed, first of all, at night on a mountaintop. And in the morning, when we slept there, the truck that followed us couldn't get near us. So we were way down in the valley. So in the morning, I heard this yell, "God Almighty, what have we got here?" And it was some squirrel hunters, West Virginia squirrel hunters with shotguns or hunting raccoons or whatever. Saw this balloon tethered in the woods.
Oh, yes.
And it had, fortunately for us, had American flags all over it. 1830 American flags. They didn't count the stars, but these guys saw the stars and stripes, so they figured it can't be a Russian. In West Virginia, they shoot first, in cases like that. I think rightly so, but in this case, we had lots of bunting and stars and stripes, except me with my frock coat and top hat, dressed in 1830s costume. They talked with me face to face and didn't even think anything of that.
Yeah,
they must have thought that's the way I dress all the time.
Normal West Virginia.
Yes, sir. So we drove. Yes, sir. Right. So we took off, and would you believe the wind brought us back right to where we took off. We were in the center of a high pressure system, which, as you know, goes clockwise. We went around the mountains. We went up over mountains, 10 feet over one mountain out there, with a long rope trailing us, drag rope it's called, to keep us our altitude right. And it was the most wonderful experience I've had in all the many hours of a balloon. But it carried us to the exact meadow where we took off from.
Oh, yes.
And the film crew thought we did that deliberately. And I said, no, that just happens. The Lord did that, you see.
Well, that was very interesting.
I've done flights in Pennsylvania where I've carried wash lines at the end. We drag a drag rope, which sometimes helps to keep the balloon from going too high. And you look, there was a screaming woman shouting, my wash, and so we had to reimburse her for that. We've pulled up trees and things like that. I can go on for that, but that's another subject.
That's a fascinating
yes, sir.
As to how adventures in ballooning.
Yes, sir, yes. So
well, that's ballooning is a very fascinating field.
And people like to hear me talk about it because they can understand a balloon, whereas they don't understand Apollo.
That's right.
They know it's a rocket, but they don't know what. And computers are a mystery to many people, as you know, and so on. All this, but a balloon has no computers. It has nothing. We have only one instrument, an altimeter, sometimes a vertimeter, which tells you you're going up and down, or we throw toilet paper overboard that shows if you're going up or down. Yeah. The paper goes up, you're going down. You see.
Oh yes. Well, that's not particularly sophisticated instrumentation.
No,
but very effective.
That's the effectiveness is important, right? Not sophistication. I remember in the Armored Corps in the war, our radios failed, our gun stabilizers never worked right. The Germans and Russians didn't bother with such nonsense. They took all that stuff out, and it worked very well. So I think there's a plea should be made for techniques that are simple.
Yeah. Well, you're still continuing your work by
remote sensing of the oceans, yes.
There
and undersea research.
Bioluminescence,
bioluminescence now, Dr. Larson. NOAA would permit me to do bioluminescence because the flashes of bioluminescence are much like cosmic ray flashes. I could use the same gear I can use for that.
Oh, yeah.
And there is a little community support for that, although it's petering off too. Bioluminescence is being handled by several universities.
Oh, yeah.
And so I hope to do an experiment this summer, and I don't know, I've done my share there too, because I got a new instrument developed that senses it, you see.
Well, you really have had a fascinating life of contributions in so many different fields of science and technology, and it's very refreshing to know that you're still as enthusiastic and as active as ever in pushing back the frontiers.
Well, Dr. Larson, well, thank you. It hasn't always been easy. I must thank my wife Helen for supporting me, sometimes with a certain amount of reluctance, thinking that she'd be a widow at an early age, you see. But she hasn't put any blocks. I know other people have tried to do things, the wives would go haywire and make a big noise, and you can't blame them. So I've had that support, and I've flown my son Andy around in a balloon, although I think his wife right now wouldn't care for that with 2 little children. People have the notion that it's dangerous, you see. Actually, people ask me when I say I've been to 10,000 feet or higher, I've been up to 30,000 feet. That's terrible. It's very dangerous. I said, once you get over 200 feet, you're just as dead if you fall out.
Oh, yes.
If you fall out at 30,000 feet, you have more time to scream, you see.
Yeah. Yes, well, that's absolutely correct and a good way of expressing it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Kurt. This has, been a real contribution to our series, and as you continue making these discoveries, it may want to have you back for a repeat, not
Yes.
repeat, but to augment this particular first film.
I have a couple of things in the works.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.